Okay, Sean, thanks so much for taking the time to speak with me on this today. Of course, the SAVE Act has come back to the forefront once again in Congress. We've seen this sort of cyclical over the years, it being introduced, passed in one chamber, and then the Senate kind of balking. So that's a little bit of background for people here. What is your perspective on this broadly to start?
I think it's important that people know more than anything else that the SAVE Act is a bill that would require Americans to show a birth certificate or a passport in order to register to vote. That 21 million adult American citizens don't have those documents handy. And so this law would disenfranchise, it would block millions of Americans from voting. And that's precisely why it died in the Senate in the past and why it should die in the Senate again this year.
Why does it disenfranchise so many people? What are the factors that disallow them from voting in one way and not being able to have these documents?
I mean, to start with, only half of Americans have a passport. And while most Americans have a birth certificate, many people don't have that document handy. They may not have access to it. I mean, I think for your viewers, if we ask you right now, do you have a passport and do you know where your birth certificate is? The answer for a lot of people is going to be no to one of those questions or both of those questions. And if that's the case, then you won't be able to get registered to vote under the SAVE Act. And that's why it would end up blocking millions of Americans from voting because that's the case for 21 million Americans across the country. I think it is bad policy for that reason. But it also could block people even beyond those 21 million. Um, People who don't have their name matching their documentation, for instance, someone who's changed their name, like someone who's been married and changed their name. So it's worse than that, but it starts with the fact that just your average American citizen, many of us don't have the documents that this bill would require of us.
For you, where does the notion of a photo ID fit into this conversation? Because I think that's the other
Uh,
argument you also hear.
yeah, the question of photo ID, voter ID just isn't part of this conversation because that's not what the SAVE Act does. The SAVE Act is a show your papers requirement, and that's how people should think of it. It requires you to show a birth certificate or a passport. The law pretends to allow you to show a real ID. It mentions real ID compliant IDs, but your real ID doesn't tell you whether you're a citizen. The real IDs are available to non-citizens and citizens. They don't indicate whether you're a citizen on the ID. And so, despite what the bill seems to be suggesting, for the vast majority of people in this country, a birth certificate or passport is what you're going to have to show. And so, I know people have been hearing for years about, voter ID laws, and they may have their opinion about voter ID laws. This is not that. This is a show your papers law.
The pop you mentioned, the individual that is married changes their name because of that. Populations of people, is it a certain or is it more broad than that that you see are would be disenfranchised here?
So the group of people who lack ready access to birth certificate or passport, so that's like 21 million people, that group is disproportionately made up of younger voters. It's disproportionately made up of voters of color. But it includes every voter from, I mean, every kind of voter from every part of the country and every demographic background. And the makeup varies state to state. So in some states, it's going to be more of this group, in other states, more of that group. So yes, there are groups who are disproportionately impacted, but this is going to impact Americans from all walks of life. The group beyond that 21 million that could potentially be impacted are people whose name doesn't match their birth certificate. So let's say you don't have a passport, you've got a birth certificate, but you're going to have to also show a photo ID that matches your birth certificate. And if you have a different name than you did when you were born, that might pose a problem. It's going to require you to complete additional steps. That group is not surprisingly going to be disproportionately made up of married women. There's some 80 million married women out there who have changed their name since getting married.
You know, you hear that the rationale behind this, and that's to root out voter fraud and things of that nature. Do you see it? Where does that fit here? And that seems to be the reasoning.
That's what they claim is the reasoning, but it's just not true. We don't have a problem with rampant voter fraud in this country, no matter what anybody tells you. We certainly already have multiple systems in place in the states to ensure that only eligible Americans are voting. That's been proven by every attempt to study this question. You know, politicians have staked their entire political careers on trying to prove that there is some problem with non-citizens voting in our elections, including Donald Trump, who had his, advisory commission in his last term trying to prove this, and then currently his Department of Justice is trying to vacuum up voter rolls, private personal data from voters across the country in order to prove this. And the results over and over again are that this just isn't a problem. Utah was the most recent state to run their voter file against this new SAVE program that DHS has to try to root out all of this voter fraud. And guess how many cases of non-citizens voting Utah found in the entire state? Zero, not a single one. So all of this scrutiny and all of this claimed, all these claimed attempts to go after voter fraud are just proving yet again that this is not a problem. And so it should really make people ask themselves, why are my representatives trying to push for this show your papers requirement? It's not solving a problem, but it's going to stop 21 million American citizens from voting. And why is that the policy that they want to pursue?
You mentioned Utah as an example, but I also will follow up and say, even if it's a minuscule percentage, 12 people, 12
Sure.
non-citizens that vote, and an election is decided by 6 votes, is that at all a concern to you? Or is there a way to be able to rectify that at the end of the day?
We can all agree that like one case is one too many, but that doesn't justify disenfranchising 21 million American citizens. We are far more likely to have our elections decided by 21 million American citizens that can't vote than we are by the one case of someone voting illegally, which oftentimes, most of the time, turns out to be someone who was misled or misunderstood their eligibility. The reality is that this country's never seen an election determined because being determined based on voter fraud like that, but having people, non-citizens voting in elections in numbers sufficient to determine the outcome of election. But our elections are regularly decided by margins smaller than 21 million. In fact, I'd wager a bet that almost always they're decided by margins smaller than 21 million. And so we should all be far more concerned about the possibility of disenfranchising 21 million American citizens than we are about doubling, tripling, quadrupling down on the systems that we already have in place to ensure that only eligible American citizens are voting.
All right, let's get to the notion of nationalizing elections that's been thrown out there by Donald Trump. But you have seen some, I think it was John Thune, sort of pouring cold water on that, saying they don't have the votes anyway. But
Mhm.
what do you think of that, and what does that mean?
Look, the president doesn't have any legal authority to run our elections. Our elections are run by state and local election officials. And the Constitution gives the power to set the rules for our elections to the states and to Congress, not to the president. So he can't do this. He has no power to do this. That doesn't mean people shouldn't take this threat seriously. Because what it is actually the president saying out loud what has been clear now for months, which is that his administration is engaged in a concerted campaign to undermine our elections. That began on day one of his administration when he pardoned the people who were responsible for the January 6th attacks, sending a very clear message to people who would subvert elections that if they do, he will have their back. It continued when he issued an executive order in March of last year, which was his attempt to engage in a federal takeover of elections, where he tried to institute by executive fiat what the SAVE Act is trying to do through legislation, a show your papers requirement to register to vote. And it has continued throughout the months that have followed. He is trying to inject himself into elections inappropriately and in violation of our Constitution. And he has vast power to accomplish things even when they are illegal. So people should be worried about that. But I want to be clear, it is illegal. We do have tools to fight back against him. We are fighting back against that in the courts. We sued over his executive order and we got a victory, and a court ruled against him and said he can't do it that way. But it's going to require everybody pushing back. It's going to require state and local election officials pushing back. It's going to require Congress pushing back. And it's going to require voters, letting their voices be heard with their members in Congress. The SAVE Act is just another prong of this campaign when the White House was asked about what he meant when he said nationalizing elections, they said, oh, he meant the SAVE Act. I don't really think that's true, but it tells people that that's just another piece of this. So they should tell their representatives to vote against the SAVE Act. And they should show up and participate in our elections and let their voices be heard in all of the ways that the First Amendment allows their voices to be heard, because the only way we're going to protect our democracy from an attempted takeover by our president is if we invest in it, we protect it, and we push and fight for the democracy that we all deserve.
This kind of goes along the lines of fighting back from the state's perspective, and that's when it comes to the voter rolls. Do you
Hmm.
of collecting those and the threats to the states that haven't turned those over? Do you see that
Yeah.
as the administration's attempt to do this without really going through Congress?
Absolutely. So the Department of Justice going around and trying to vacuum up personal voter data from around the country is part and parcel of the Trump administration's campaign to undermine our elections. He actually ordered that in his executive order last year. And most of the states have been doing their job and standing up to those requests and saying, you have no right to my voters' personal information. A few, unfortunately, have just acquiesced and handed personal voter information, driver's license numbers, social security numbers right over the Department of Justice without security protocols, without asking questions. That's a shame, but most states have stood up against him, and so they've ended up being sued by the Department of Justice in many instances. And the couple of court rulings we've had so far, the courts have stood by these states and refusing to turn over personal data. So I think people should absolutely view that as part of this attempt at a federal takeover. The Department of Justice has actually said clearly in the agreements that they offer to states when they ask for their voter file that what they're going to do with these voter files is they're going to try to identify ineligible citizens on the rolls, and then they make the states agree that when they send them a list of ineligible citizens that they've or ineligible voters that they've identified, that the state has 45 days to remove those voters from the rolls. That's not the federal government's job. They don't have the expertise, they don't have the know-how, they don't have the tools to be doing voter list maintenance. State election officials do that, and they do it well. And so this is the federal government trying to meddle in our elections, and people should be happy when their state officials push back against that, and really upset when their state officials just give right in and hand over their data to the federal government.